So I think I got us off track immediately, which is good, I guess. So next up, Delicious Ambitions. Really excited about this panel. So two speakers, Klaus Meyer and Lucas Denton. Klaus Meyer probably needs no introduction, but I'm going to give it a shot anyway. Klaus Meyer is a Danish restaurateur and culinary entrepreneur, the initiator of the New Nordic Cuisine movement and co-founder of the Nordic Food Lab, and Noma rated the world's best restaurant 4 times on the world's 50 best restaurant list. That's an achievement in itself, but everything else he does is incredibly awesome, so I'll leave that to you to talk about. Lucas Denton, Executive Director, Content and Communications, Melting Pot Foundation, US. Lucas, let's see, the Melting Pot Foundation is, the US arm is in Brownsville, Brooklyn. Prior to joining Melting Pot as a project manager in 2014, he worked as a forester, a researcher for the New York City Commission on Human Rights, an iron worker for Skanska USA at the World Trade Center, and a variety of culinary positions from dishwasher to line cook. Equally impressive, by the way. So please join us up here, and I'll leave it to the two of you.
Thanks a lot for having us. So I will kind of start this out, but I feel I'm almost here to prepare the stage for Luke. He's 20 years younger than I am, so not so many years or decades from here. I hope that I can look myself in the mirror and see upon myself with the eyes of my father, and tell me that I've done my part and I can, slow down, relax a little bit. But I will spend maybe the first 15, 18 minutes giving you a short outline of the road I followed, or the calling that picked me, in order for me to move from my childhood in southern Denmark to starting Noma and eventually ending up here in New York, where I live with my family now. The main reason why I arrived was that I set out to open a fine dining restaurant, Agern, meaning acorn, in Grand Central Terminal, and a Scandinavian-themed food hall. But then I met this young man in a queue in front of a bakery in Bed-Stuy 3 years ago, and that kind of, in a way, changed my life. But Lucas will tell that part of the story. Many of you, I believe, have heard about the country called Denmark. And Denmark, what you may not be knowing is that Denmark is a country where an unholy alliance of ascetic doctors and Puritan priests have led a 300-year-long anti-hedonistic crusade against the pleasure-giving qualities of food and against sensuality as such. So the idea of preparing wonderful meals in Denmark, and maybe even in Sweden, and at least in Norway, the idea of preparing beautiful food for your beloved ones was, for something like 300 years since Luther, considered a sin in line with theft, exaggerated dancing, abuse of alcohol, incest, and masturbation. So the idea that was so successfully communicated by those fine people was that if you want to live a long and healthy life on earth and avoid going to hell, what you have to do is to eat something of inferior taste and get it over with in a hurry. It was in this exact spirit that I was brought up in a middle-class family back in the 60s in the poorest part of Denmark. My mother, Ulla, represented the first generation of Danish women working outside the home, which didn't exactly benefit the quality of our meals. My mother's luck was that this was also an era of canned meatballs, potato powder, stock cubes, and frozen vegetables that we ate a lot of in my childhood. And then we ate a lot of margarine packed with trans fatty acids. That was the most common sauce I ate in my childhood, was just melted margarine. What then radically gave my life direction. Also, I mean, my parents literally divorced to the sound of the microwave oven when I was 14 years old. But what gave my life some sort of direction was that I went to Paris to work as an au pair at the age of 19. I got hepatitis there and ended up on a recreational stay with this fantastic man in the photo called Guy Sversut, a pastry chef and a baker in Agen, the capital of Gascony. The magical thing about our encounter was that I have kind of lost contact to my father, and Guy and Elizabeth, they couldn't have children. So they almost adopted me as a kind of a son in the family, and he taught me much more than only how to debone partridge and stuff it with a farcing made from foie gras truffles and other wonders from the region of Gascony. Guy was a Renaissance man, much unlike my father. And at a certain point, I know when you think back on your lives, I'm sure that there's a couple of moments that helped define you, shape you, become who you became. And one of those moments happened in Gascony when I was 20 years old, and where my father's life philosophy and the life philosophy of this Renaissance man kind of, collide? So my father, he was a guy who taught me how to cut the grass lane around our house very quickly. He said for him, happiness was about doing everything you do just more efficiently with a higher outcome relative to the number of calories as the input. So he was overseeing me cutting the grass lane around our house 3 times a week, 2 years in a row. And he gave me penalty seconds if I left unfinished patches. And I became very good at cutting the grass lane quickly. Then one day I was kind of looking at the commercial horrors of this man's pastry shop. He had way too many employees. He was baking the most fantastic cakes in the entire country, but he sold them at the price his grandfather had taken 60 years ago, and he gave many of them away, and he threw most of it out because he had so many employees he could just start all over the next morning. And his wife was unhappy. She couldn't buy a new dress, or she didn't see any part of France other than Gascony. And one day I addressed it, and I expected some sort of accolade. But he just laid his 2 big pastry chef hands on my shoulders and told me a couple of things I will probably remember till the end of my life. The first thing he said was more or less what is written there. Le bonheur, mon fils, c'est savoir ce que l'on veut et le vouloir passionnément. Et quoi que tu fasses, il faut que tu l'aimes. In English it means happiness, my son. He always called me my son. Happiness, my son, is a matter of knowing what you want to do with your life and having the guts to follow your heart. The second thing he told me that morning was, he said, another thing, he was quoting a philosopher called Félicien Marceau. He said, le temps, c'est le pire ennemi, non pas seulement des métiers de bouche, mais aussi de l'amour et de l'homme, tout bref. Haste is the worst enemy, not only for gastronomy, but also for love, if not for humanity as such. This was a very different message from my father's message. My father said, I don't care shit about what you do in your life as long as you goddamn hurry up. And Guy told me, with looking at me with love, the only thing that matters, son, is that you follow your heart. The essence or the end game or the conclusion of all that was that I came back to Denmark at the age of 21 with a strong feeling that something was rotten in our food culture and that the impact was much larger than lousy food. I almost got a calling in France, and I knew what I wanted to try in my grown-up life in Denmark, and that was to use deliciousness and food as a weapon, as an instrument to basically improve the quality of life in families and in general. I didn't know what I was doing. I couldn't study it anywhere. So I kind of found my own ways, and my father was an entrepreneur, so I eventually, after having studied at Copenhagen Business School, Culture and Communication, and some economy stuff, I started a large number of very small companies, and I was very much in love with everything French, so I was maybe almost like a French food ambassador in Denmark. I should have won a prize for that. And it took me almost 17 years, and it was actually only at the moment where Guy was about to pass away, and he told me that he was of the opinion that I'd done enough for France, and that I should focus on the opportunities in our own landscapes, that I kind of got it right. At that point of time, back in 2001, I said that maybe he's right. Maybe instead of being ashamed of coming from Scandinavia, when it comes to food, maybe instead of having to cook every kind of meal with foie gras and truffles and breast chicken and olive oil from Liguria, maybe there is some sort of strength in our own terroir, in our own territory. And maybe, even though we come from a Puritan culture, we also can allow ourselves to dream that one day, if we kind of reach out for this together, maybe one day will come where we can hand over to our children a food culture that is so much more beautiful, admirable, and responsible than the one we happen to inherit from our parents. That was the kind of reflections that led to the idea of starting Noma, based on the simple idea that for the first time, since maybe 100 and a number of years, we would create a very ambitious restaurant that would rely 100% on local produce, sourced from not only Denmark, because as you know, maybe some of you know, Denmark is a country with almost a monopolistic agricultural and industrial food producing system. We had one brewery, one dairy, one pork producer, and lack of diversity doesn't really promote anything great. So we said, and also the notion that Danish food was polluted by all the horrendous food that had been cooked in the past under that name. So we kind of fell in love with the idea of this being also larger than ourselves, and therefore hang on to the idea of a new Nordic cuisine, which will also give us access to beautiful, iconic, mythical, mysterious products from the more remote areas of Norway, Sweden, Finland, and even the Arctic areas. In any case, we were about to go bankrupt at Noma. After 6 months, no more money left and no demand. Basically, nobody woke up in the morning with a strong desire to eat rotten intestines of Arctic birds or seal penis or baby whales or rakefish or surströmming or other of those scary rarities from the national Scandinavian culinary chambers of horror. Many people would wake up with a desire to eat a pizza or some lasagna, or maybe even confit de canard or a burger. But Nordic food, nobody knew what it was. So we realized that in order to not to go bankrupt and kind of achieve the mission of the restaurant, which was to amplify the understanding of the potential within our own agricultural system, we knew that we had to change demand. How do we change demand? How do we build a shift of paradigm? And what we did was that we asked ourselves, okay, let's see how we can onboard all the major stakeholders in our region. And in order to do that, we spent 8 months on trying to formulate an ideology, a sort of a manifesto. We basically asked ourselves the question, if a new food culture should be one of the greatest in the world in year 2003, which values should it lean on in the process? What should it deliver to the world in order from the perspective of the world to be considered great? And we found out that this was much larger than just a question of deliciousness. And the rest is history. The Nordic Council of Ministers, all the national governments, cooks from the whole Scandinavian region jumped onto this extremely open-sourced process where there was no logo, no precedent, no rules to obey, only a pretty inclusive set of sort of almost spiritual guidelines that you should follow if you wanted to connect to this co-created movement defined by the actions of the almost endless list of all types of actors that wanted to execute and achieve this win-win-win scenario. Coming out of it 5 years later, Noma being voted the best restaurant in the world, also being surrounded by a very strong, extremely professional, competent head chef, I asked myself, well, was this then the end? or is there more into this idea than just promoting our own region in the world? And a moment of enlightenment arrived when one evening I was called up by an old man from the Danish Gastronomic Academy that had helped co-write the manifesto, and he told me that he was of the understanding that you could leave the word Nordic out of the word, the new Nordic Cuisine Manifesto. I think, are you kidding? You cannot take out the word Nordic from the Nordic Cuisine Manifesto, it doesn't work. Go read it, he said. And then I went to read it, and I actually got the feeling that maybe he was right, that this was not about Scandinavia, this was about defending any food culture in the world against McDonaldization or imperialization. Basically, it was a defense mechanism for indigenous food cultures all over the world. And then suddenly I said, wow, this is interesting. I had a company that had started earning money, which allowed me to set up in 2010 a not-for-profit melting pot with the aim of exploring if with a little bit of the money that I could use myself or spend myself on this and the knowledge of the company, if we could help improve the quality of life for marginalized and vulnerable people using food, culinary craft, and entrepreneurship as tools. The first thing we embarked on was a collaboration with the Danish Prison Service in order to set up food schools in a closed state prison, Swedish-American in outside Copenhagen. One of the most rewarding and unforgettable experiences in my professional life. The second thing, and that was actually the meaning with Melting Pot, with the establishment of this foundation, that was to explore if the learnings from Noma and starting the Nordic cuisine movement could be used to benefit a struggling community. To make this short, we ended up in Bolivia, started Melting Pot Bolivia, a country where 1 out of 4 is suffering from hunger, where 1 out of 3 is unemployed, a country with the largest unexplored biological diversity worldwide, and also a country longing for something to be proud of, having lost all wars and most football matches in 150 years. For a number of reasons, we kind of have succeeded with this social project, and some of the main reasons for this success is the 2 people I picked to send down to Bolivia and kind of try to execute this vision, Michelangelo Cesari and Camila Seidler, who was this year voted best female chef in Latin America by all other chefs and food journalists on the World 50 Best, and the restaurant itself, being a social project operated by young people found in the slums of La Paz, was voted, I think it was 15 this year on the Latin American list. I feel I'm running out of time. How much time has I spent so far?
I'm sorry, I don't know.
Looky.
It looks like you got 13 minutes.
I spent or have used?
You have left.
So you have also left 30 minutes?
Yes.
So I just want to get out of this, away from this stage. So I just want to say that we try to only work with kids from families exposed to violence. And it proved too difficult for us to give Bolivia a world-class restaurant working only with Bolivian produce. And we felt ashamed of letting them down. The luck was that a Dutch NGO found us 2 years after we had launched Gusto. And they said, we are doing a tremendous job. We have $2 million that are burning in our pockets. We don't know how to spend them in Bolivia. Everything just goes belly up. What about you building a train-the-trainer culinary educational system through which the learnings, the ideas, the concept from your fine dining restaurant can benefit the slums of El Alto? And that idea led to the establishment of 12 cafeterias and micro schools directly in the slums operated by the students of Gusto, now having trained 2,500 kids over a span of 2.5 years. And I don't know what the exit strategy looks like. I don't know what the end game is, but this is kind of where we are. And then I ran into this young man 3 years ago, and that gave me a sense of meaning being here in New York City with my family. Looky.
Nope. There we go. Claus, thank you for that very kind introduction. So yeah, about 3 years ago, I think it was April 2013, I was working with the New York City Commission on Human Rights. We were doing a study in collaboration with Columbia University, the racial dynamics of the rental housing market. And I was living in Bedford-Stuyvesant. So I was watching the process of gentrification, which is happening, certainly happening in Europe, but happening very intensely in Brooklyn. in my personal life, living in the neighborhood, and professionally, working with the commission. And it was a Saturday morning. I was helping a friend change a flat tire outside of the Scratch Bread Bakery in Bed-Stuy, and I hear a very large, passionate man talking in this strange elfin language, and kind of making waves, and I figured I should probably introduce myself to him, calm down, welcome him to the neighborhood, and it turns out it was Claus. I'd never heard of Noma, never heard of the New Nordic cuisine movement. As was previously mentioned, I'd spent some time working in kitchens, but that's something, it was never a passion of mine. It's something that you often do when you're interested in nonprofit work in America, because it doesn't tend to pay very well. So I had some experience with food. Started talking to Claus, and he told me that he was, scouting different excellent locations in New York City. He was planning on moving here with his family and starting a large-scale food project in Grand Central Station. And then he told me about Bolivia, and he said he'd like to do something similar in a struggling neighborhood in New York City. And I said, the Bolivian project sounds amazing. However, if you put a fine dining destination restaurant in a struggling neighborhood in New York City, chances are you may end up hurting the residents rather than helping them. The rents go up, people get pushed out, services get drawn to the newcomers to the neighborhood rather than the currently existing residents. And he said, really, explain to me more. A reaction which, I'll say this was before Claus and I met and became friends. I didn't say it necessarily as nicely as I've just said it, and his reaction was, tell me more, and I was intrigued by that and impressed. And the very next day, he sent me a barrage of emails asking me questions about the history of inequality in America, urban revitalization, racial dynamics. So that began the conversation, which in 2014 began with my visiting of Brownsville. So how did we choose Brownsville? So one of my least favorite things to do when I get up and talk about the neighborhood is have to spit out this long list of kind of horrifying statistics, because it's not representative of what the neighborhood actually is. But it is the neighborhood with the highest rates of diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, infant mortality, homicide. It's the highest concentration of public housing in North America and has the lowest life expectancy of any neighborhood in New York City, about 11 years less than any of the more prosperous neighborhoods. So that paints a bleak picture. So we surveyed a lot of the neighborhoods in New York City that are called food deserts or are suffering from public health crisis. South Bronx, East Harlem, East New York. A lot of those other neighborhoods had really good programs going in them, and there were measurable improvements in public health. Brownsville didn't have any outside organizations doing large-scale operations or programming that were seeming to have any kind of effect whatsoever. And so in August of 2014, I went and I met with the community board in Brownsville and asked them, what can we do to help? So Claus and I both had the understanding, one of the things that drew us together, that we didn't really have any solutions for Brownsville. What we had was resources. And can one combat poverty with deliciousness is a question appropriate certainly for Denmark and Bolivia. But one of the very first things that the people of Brownsville let us know was the best way to combat poverty is with money. So what they wanted from us more so than a food revolution was jobs. So we very quickly got the basic idea for the Brownsville Community Culinary Center. We knew that we had resources in culinary education. We knew that we had the ability to do job training, but how to implement that. So we spent about a year working with other organizations. A health impact assessment was conducted in which we got access to a broad array of neighborhood stakeholders, people who lived in private housing, public housing, other representatives from NGOs, local community leaders, and put forth to them iteration after iteration of our idea. How can we get resources that would improve public health and create jobs in the neighborhood? And through that process, we partnered very closely with a woman named Brenda Duchesne, who lives in Brownsville, has for about 30 years, runs 6 community gardens after school cooking demonstrations, etiquette classes, Christmas pageants, etc., all almost completely on her own dime, which is not extensive, with the help of community volunteers. So Ultimately, we found a location on Belmont Avenue to locate the Brownsville Community Culinary Center and Neighborhood Eatery. So we knew that we wanted to cook delicious foods for the community, foods that were relevant, culturally relevant, also healthy. So how are we going to do that? We also knew that we wanted to implement a culinary training program that would not only give people jobs, but set the basis for a culinary career so that people could earn a living wage and raise families in a neighborhood with the highest unemployment rate in New York City. So in order to get the food right, in the fall of last year, we went into the Van Dyke Senior Center, which is, the Van Dyke House is the largest public housing complex in Brownsville, also the poorest zip code in New York City. And we went in there with the idea that we might be able to get straight up recipes from these seniors and then just cook them in the restaurant. We didn't get recipes. What we got was a thimble full of this and a pinch of that. We didn't get recipes. But what we did get was even more fruitful for us. What we got was stories. We heard from people who'd moved to Brownsville from all over the world, from South America, from Central America. These are people, all of whose cultural background is reflective of the African diaspora, but it wasn't just the American South, or it wasn't just other cities, it was all over the world. And so what we realized through the stories they gave us was that we could access basically the history of world food culture through the cuisine of the African diaspora. That was one element that was really hopeful for the educational program with our students, because we're now able to teach foods that are culturally relevant, but also through that connect them to world cuisine and give them a broad base of culinary knowledge. The other thing we came to understand was the role that food had played for them as children in creating community. And we also got to hear the very sad story of how the resources to cook those foods had diminished and evaporated as they'd lived in Brownsville, and they described to us in detail that process, even to the extent where they would talk about what happened to their families when certain markets closed and how their family structure began to disintegrate around that. So we were able to work with other academics and entities to help develop a program through which we could distill those narratives into menu items and how it would inform the way that meals were delivered in the Brownsville Community Culinary Center. So what we have now in May 2nd, we began a pilot program at a local church kitchen as we build out our facility on Belmont Avenue, in which we took in 7 students in a very unstructured way. Teaching the classes, a woman named Meyer, who taught in the Danish prison programs that Claus mentioned. We started with these 7 students, and we began in a community garden in Brownsville and eventually moved to this church kitchen. We still have 6 of them. The attrition rate for programming in Brownsville is 60%, so we're beating that handily. And we just took in another group of 8 students 2 weeks ago, and they're all doing very well. Our first group is now on externship, and we'll bring them back for when the facility opens on Belmont Avenue in April. So the educational program is 1 year long. One thing we realized very quickly was that we needed to pay these students. A lot of the community members would tell us, they need to pay you, they need some skin in the game. What we found immediately was that crisis is the default in the lives of these students. 2 of our students became homeless, 1 had a drug overdose, and a lot of these problems come simply back to not having enough money to fully engage the program. So we now pay our students a stipend of $10.50 an hour to study 24 hours a week. They'll be operating the restaurant out on Belmont Avenue when it opens in April. And the restaurant will offer a 50% discount to recipients of the SNAP benefits, food stamps, to make sure that the food is available for all members of the community. The food will be reasonably and competitively priced with all of the other food in the neighborhood. However, the people who live in private housing in Brownsville have about a 20% lower median income than the average in New York City. The people in public housing have a median income of less than $15,000 a year. So even within Brownsville, there are some dynamics that need to be addressed by our pricing model. And all of the foods that we serve in the Brownsville Community Culinary Center will be baked and cooked fresh and healthy on a daily basis using all items from scratch, no preservatives or anything of that nature. We'll partner with local community gardens to bring in fresh ingredients from the community. So the one thing that's also really important to note is that this restaurant will be meant specifically for currently existing residents of the community. We've worked very diligently to establish a broad base of support with the community so that we can get consistent input on how to tailor all of our programming features to make the restaurant serve the community's needs. We are not trying to attract outside members. We had one article published entitled "Claus Meyer Opening New Restaurant in Brownsville, Brooklyn's poorest neighborhood." And what we very much hope does not happen is that the foodies who read Eater or Grubhub all kind of swarm into the neighborhood and start testing the food. Brownsville is in a very precarious situation. I know we're all I can speak for myself and the community. Nobody in Brownsville is very happy to see the results of our current election, but the federal government under Obama maintained the conditions in Brownsville, which are not great. So now more than ever, Brownsville is under threat and very on edge about outside entities coming in, very suspicious. And luckily, we've built up a well of trust. And in order to maintain that, we need to remain open to the input from the community and make sure that all of our programming and all of our actions reflect that input in order to maintain that trust. And our program will have absolutely no effectiveness whatsoever if we can't maintain that trust. So ultimately, what we've found is that what we're developing in Brownsville is a site-specific model. It's not an approach that could be implanted somewhere else immediately where we could expect success. But what we have found is that the way that we approach the neighborhood is the key to our success there thus far. So check back in a year. Hopefully we'll be able to have graduated about 60 students by that time. Everybody will have guaranteed jobs at a living wage. And we're still developing the metrics on how we're going to be able to measure whether we're positively impacting public health in the community, but we'll be able to serve at least 30,000 meals to people who receive SNAP benefits within the next year. So thank you very much.
No, we won't do that. Slide.
Can I take a picture, please?
Thank you, Klaus and Lucas.